My name is Wallace Pruitt, and I am 83 years old. 4 months ago, at a Memorial Day gathering hosted by my son-in-law's country club, in front of nearly 100 of his business associates and friends, he leaned over to a colleague, gestured toward me with his cocktail glass, and said, loud enough for several nearby people to hear clearly, that I was just some old nobody his wife felt obligated to drag along to these things. 30 minutes later, at the actual memorial ceremony taking place on the club's back lawn, 400 veterans in attendance for a regional remembrance event stood, in complete unison, the moment they recognized who I was, every single one of them coming to attention and holding it, silently, for nearly a full minute, in front of the very man who just called me a nobody. If you've ever been dismissed as insignificant by someone who never once bothered to ask who you actually were, stay with me until the end. This story isn't about revenge against my son-in-law. It's about what happens when an entire community of people who actually know your worth shows up, all at once, at exactly the moment you needed them most, without even knowing they were needed at all. Welcome to Silent Honor USA, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most. If this story moves you, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. And subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly what happened once that lawn went silent. I need to tell you who I was before I tell you about that Memorial Day, because otherwise, 400 veterans standing in unison won't mean what it's supposed to mean. I enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1960, 18 years old, following a path that felt, at the time, less like a decision and more like an inevitability. Having grown up in a household where my own father, a Marine himself during the Second World War, never discussed his service directly, but carried a particular bearing that told you, without words, exactly what kind of discipline and sacrifice had shaped him. I served 3 tours in Vietnam between 1965 and 1971, years that reshaped me in ways I've spent the following 5.5 decades learning how to carry, rather than fully explain to anyone who wasn't there alongside me. I want to tell you about a specific period of my service that matters enormously to understanding everything that happened 4 months ago. In 1967, during my second tour, I was assigned to a role that took me away from direct combat command and into something considerably more specialized, working alongside a small team responsible for developing and refining specific tactical training protocols that would eventually be implemented across multiple Marine units operating in similarly difficult terrain. This work, unglamorous and largely invisible even to many of the men who eventually benefited from it, involved analyzing after-action reports from failed operations, identifying specific tactical errors, and developing revised protocols that reduced casualties in subsequent operations using similar terrain and enemy tactics. I remember specifically the particular grinding tedium of that work, sitting for hours in a briefing room, reading through casualty reports and terrain assessments, cross-referencing patterns that most people, understandably, would find far too abstract and bloodless to fully appreciate the weight of. But I remember, too, the specific satisfaction of finally identifying a pattern that mattered, a particular flanking approach that had failed repeatedly in dense jungle terrain because the standard protocol didn't account for a specific visibility issue during early morning fog conditions common to that particular region. I remember drafting the revised protocol, testing it against 3 subsequent after-action reports once it had been implemented, and watching casualty rates drop significantly in operations using similar terrain, a result I experienced not through any direct combat satisfaction, but through the quiet, private knowledge that somewhere, men I would never meet were coming home because of work conducted entirely at a desk. I don't say this to diminish the men who fought directly in those operations, whose courage under fire deserves every ounce of recognition it receives. I say it because the specific nature of my own contribution, quiet, analytical, largely invisible work conducted mostly in briefing rooms and after-action reviews, rather than in direct combat, meant that the actual scope of what I'd contributed to the broader war effort never translated into the kind of visible, easily explained heroism that makes for compelling dinner table stories. I came home with real, documented decorations for specific actions during my first tour. including a Bronze Star for an engagement in 1966, an action I'll admit is somewhat easier to explain in casual conversation, involving a firefight and a specific decision under direct fire that fits more comfortably into the kind of narrative people expect when they ask a veteran about his service. But the work I'm proudest of, the tactical protocols that continued protecting Marine units for years after my own service ended, never came with a medal at all, simply the quiet, internal knowledge that men I'd never meet were coming home alive because of analysis I'd conducted in rooms far from any actual battlefield. I stayed in the Marine Corps for a full career, 28 years total, eventually retiring in 1988 as a sergeant major, having spent the final decade of my service in a training command role, teaching younger officers and senior enlisted Marines the same kind of careful, analytical approach to tactical planning that had defined my own most significant contributions during Vietnam. Those training command years represented, in many ways, the most personally satisfying chapter of my entire career, watching young officers arrive full of raw enthusiasm and considerable overconfidence, and helping shape that raw material into the kind of disciplined, careful judgment that would eventually serve them and the Marines under their command, across decades of subsequent service in conflicts I would never personally witness. I want to be honest that this particular chapter of my career, the training command years, produced ripples I still, even now, occasionally learn about, decades later, from Marines who tell me, sometimes at veteran gatherings, that a specific lesson I taught them shaped a decision that saved lives in conflicts that happened long after I'd already retired to civilian life. I remember, specifically, a conversation several years ago with a retired colonel who'd passed through my training command as a young captain in the mid-1980s, who told me, with genuine emotion, about a specific tactical decision he'd made during a deployment in the early 2000s, decades after his own training under me had concluded, a decision he attributed directly to a specific analytical framework I'd taught him about assessing terrain-based risk before committing forces to an engagement. That conversation, more than almost any single moment from my active service itself, has stayed with me as proof of exactly what quiet, unglamorous training work can actually accomplish across generations, invisibly, without ever generating the kind of recognition that visible combat action receives. My wife Doris passed 6 years ago, and since then, I've lived a quiet retirement outside of Norfolk, Virginia, close enough to the Naval and Marine Corps community there that I remain, even now, genuinely connected to a broader veteran network that spans generations, a community that has become, particularly since Doris's passing, one of the most consistent and meaningful sources of connection remaining in my life. Doris met me in 1963, at a dance held on base while I was between deployments, and she carried, throughout our 42 years of marriage, an understanding of exactly what my career had cost me, having watched, across decades, the particular quiet weight I brought home from certain assignments. Weight she never pushed me to fully explain, but that she always somehow, instinctively, knew how to sit beside without demanding words I wasn't ready to offer. We raised one daughter, Caroline, who married her husband Preston, about 14 years ago. Preston runs a successful commercial real estate development firm, a career built on visible, measurable markers of success. Deals closed, properties developed, memberships at exactly the kind of exclusive country club where the Memorial Day gathering 4 months ago took place. I don't say that to diminish what Preston has built, which represents genuine professional accomplishment through real effort. I say it because I think it matters to understanding the particular dynamic that developed between us over 14 years of marriage to my daughter, a dynamic where Preston's success was always fully visible, discussed openly, celebrated publicly, and mine, by the very nature of what I'd actually contributed during my career, never could be in quite the same way. I remember, early in Preston and Caroline's relationship, attending a dinner where Preston spent nearly 20 minutes describing a recently closed development deal in impressive, granular detail, and I remember the particular contrast when the conversation briefly turned to my own career. My answer, modest and general, apparently registering as considerably less noteworthy simply because it couldn't be summarized in similarly concrete, dollar figure terms. I noticed, over the years of Preston and Caroline's marriage, a particular pattern developing in how Preston discussed my background, both to my face and, I gathered from occasional comments Caroline shared with me, to others in his social and business circles. Early on, it was simple, somewhat dismissive curiosity, questions about my military career that I answered honestly but modestly, never volunteering the specific weight of what I'd actually done, partly out of the same discretion that had shaped my entire relationship with my own service, and partly because Preston's questions never seemed to carry much genuine interest beneath their surface politeness. Over time, as those surface-level exchanges consistently produced nothing that impressed Preston in the particular way his own social circle measured impressiveness, expensive titles, visible achievements, memberships and associations that carried immediate social currency, I watched his attitude toward me curdle into something closer to a kind of casual, habitual dismissal, an assumption, unspoken but increasingly evident, that whatever I'd done during my career simply didn't register as significant by the standards that actually mattered to him. 4 months ago, Caroline and Preston hosted, or more accurately, Preston's Country Club hosted, a Memorial Day gathering that combined a social event for members and their guests with an actual regional veterans memorial ceremony, an arrangement I later learned had been years in the making, the club having developed a genuine, meaningful partnership with several regional veterans organizations to host this combined event annually, drawing attendance from veterans across multiple branches and generations of service. Caroline invited me specifically, knowing how much the memorial ceremony portion of the event would mean to me, and I arrived that afternoon, dressed appropriately for what I understood would be a fairly formal country club gathering, genuinely looking forward to both the social portion of the day and the memorial ceremony that would follow. I want to tell you about the specific moment that set the rest of that afternoon in motion, because the details matter to understanding exactly what happened next. About an hour into the social gathering, before the memorial ceremony itself had begun, I was standing near a refreshment table, having just finished a pleasant conversation with one of Caroline's friends, when I overheard Preston, standing perhaps 15 feet away with one of his business colleagues, gesturing toward me with his cocktail glass. The club's patio was crowded with well-dressed guests, the particular ambient hum of a successful social gathering, and I doubt Preston had any specific awareness that his voice, pitched to carry over that background noise, had reached me as clearly as it had. "That's my father-in-law," Preston said, his voice carrying the particular loose confidence of a man several drinks into a pleasant afternoon, comfortable enough in his own social territory to say things he might have held back elsewhere. "Honestly, between us, he's just some old nobody Caroline feels obligated to drag along to these things. Retired military, did something or other for almost 30 years, but you know how that generation is, never really amounted to much beyond a government pension. Nice enough guy, just not exactly someone with much of a story." His colleague laughed, the kind of polite, uncertain laugh people offer when they're not entirely sure a joke has landed the way it was intended, glancing briefly in my direction to gauge whether I might have overheard. I had, every word of it landing with a particular clarity that made the pleasant afternoon around me suddenly feel considerably colder. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily anger, though some sting was certainly present. Men who've spent nearly 3 decades in military service, particularly service that involved the kind of quiet, analytical work I'd contributed during Vietnam, develop a particular capacity to absorb this kind of casual dismissal without much visible reaction. A professional habit that had served me well across countless similar moments over the decades since retiring. What I felt was something quieter and more specific, a tired, familiar recognition of a pattern that had been building for 14 years, spoken now plainly, in front of an audience, at an event specifically meant to honor veterans. I didn't respond directly. I finished my drink, found a quiet spot near the edge of the gathering to collect myself, and prepared to simply endure the remainder of the social hour before the memorial ceremony itself began, the way I imagine many veterans of my generation have learned to endure countless similar moments across the decades since coming home from a war that, in its own particular way, never received the recognition it deserved either. What happened next? I want to be absolutely clear, was not something I orchestrated in any way. I had no advanced knowledge whatsoever that it was coming, and I want you to understand the full context of how it unfolded, because the specific mechanics matter to why it carried the weight it did. About 30 minutes after that overheard exchange, the gathering shifted from its social phase into the formal memorial ceremony, guests moving from the clubhouse patio out toward the expansive back lawn, where rows of chairs had been arranged, facing a small stage and podium, a large American flag positioned prominently behind it. I made my way toward the seating area along with everyone else, still carrying the quiet weight of what I'd overheard, prepared simply to observe the ceremony respectfully, as I'd done at countless similar events over the years. As I approached the seating area, I began noticing something unusual, a particular ripple of recognition moving through clusters of veterans already gathered near the front rows, men and women in various states of formal dress, some in full uniform representing veterans organizations, others in more casual attire but wearing unit pins and service caps that identified their branches and eras of service. I noticed several of them glancing toward me, then toward each other, a particular quiet communication passing between people who recognized something the broader crowd hadn't yet registered. A man I recognized immediately, though it had been perhaps 8 years since I'd last seen him in person, approached me directly, his face breaking into genuine, evident emotion. Colonel Raymond Achebe had served under my direct training command in the early 1980s, a young officer at the time whose career I'd taken particular interest in developing, and who had gone on to a distinguished career of his own, eventually retiring as a full colonel, before becoming deeply involved in regional veterans advocacy work. "Sergeant Major Pruitt," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough that several nearby veterans turned toward the sound. "I had no idea you'd be here today. This is genuinely remarkable timing." Before I could fully respond, Colonel Achebe turned, and in a voice pitched to carry across the gathering veterans, made an announcement that would set the rest of that afternoon in motion. "Everyone, I want you to know that Sergeant Major Wallace Pruitt is here with us today. For those of you who don't recognize the name directly, I promise you, if you served in any capacity connected to Marine Corps tactical training between the late 1960s and 1988, some piece of your own training, and quite possibly some piece of the reason you came home alive from wherever you eventually served, traces back to protocols and lessons this man developed and taught. I want you to understand what happened next, because I still, 4 months later, find myself genuinely moved describing it. Across that gathering of nearly 400 veterans, representing multiple branches and generations of service, a wave of recognition moved through the crowd, and then, beginning near the front and spreading rapidly outward, veterans began standing, one by one and then in clusters, coming to attention, many of them saluting, the entire assembled gathering rising in complete, unified silence, holding that position for what I'm told, by several people who timed it afterward from photographs and video, was nearly a full minute. I remember, specifically, the particular sound of nearly 400 people rising simultaneously, chairs scraping softly against the manicured lawn, the sudden absence of the low ambient conversation that had been humming across the gathering moments earlier, replaced by something considerably more profound, a collective silence that felt, in the moment, almost physical in its weight. I stood there, 83 years old, absorbing the sight of 400 people, most of whom I'd never personally met, standing in silent, unified recognition of decades of work I genuinely never expected to be acknowledged so publicly or so completely. I felt my throat tighten in a way I hadn't anticipated. Decades of quiet, largely unrecognized contributions suddenly, overwhelmingly witnessed, all at once, on a country club lawn I'd arrived at that afternoon, expecting nothing more than a pleasant social gathering. I noticed, scattered throughout the standing crowd, a considerable number of older veterans with tears visible on their faces, men whose own service, I understood in that moment, had likely benefited in some specific, traceable way from the analytical work I'd conducted decades earlier. Men who understood, In a way, the broader civilian gathering simply couldn't, exactly what that quiet, invisible contribution had actually meant to their own survival and the survival of countless others. I want to tell you specifically about Preston's reaction during this moment, because I think it matters to the rest of this story. I glanced toward where he stood, near the edge of the seated crowd, and watched his face move through a rapid, visible sequence of confusion, dawning recognition, and something that looked, increasingly, like genuine horror as he processed exactly what was unfolding in front of him and exactly what he'd said, less than an hour earlier, about the very man now receiving this unprecedented, spontaneous recognition from 400 veterans. Caroline, standing beside him, had tears streaming openly down her face, and I could see her glancing between the standing crowd and her husband, with an expression I recognized immediately as a complicated mixture of pride in me and something considerably harder to categorize directed at Preston. Colonel Achebe spoke again once the crowd had settled, addressing the gathering more formally now, his voice carrying the particular measured authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention in far more consequential settings than a country club lawn. I want to share something specific, if Sergeant Major Pruitt will permit me. In 1967, during his second tour in Vietnam, this man was part of a small team responsible for analyzing tactical failures and developing revised protocols that dramatically reduced casualties in subsequent operations. He then spent the final decade of his career training officers and senior enlisted Marines in exactly this kind of careful, analytical approach to tactical planning. I am one of hundreds of officers who passed through his training command, and I can tell you, without exaggeration, that lessons this man taught me personally have shaped decisions I made decades later that saved lives in situations he will never know the specific details of. Because that's simply how this kind of legacy works. It moves forward invisibly, through generations of people who never fully know each other's names, but who owe each other everything. He paused, glancing around the silent, still-standing crowd before continuing. I think it's worth saying plainly, for anyone here who might not fully understand what they're witnessing. This kind of work, the quiet, analytical work that shapes training and tactics rather than generating headlines or medals, rarely gets this kind of recognition. Most of the men and women who do it spend their entire careers, and often their entire lives afterward, without anyone outside a small circle of fellow veterans ever understanding what they actually contributed. What you're seeing today, this many people standing spontaneously, is not something that happens often, and it's not something Sergeant Major Pruitt sought or expected. It's simply what happens when enough of the people who benefited from that quiet work happen to be gathered in one place at one time, and recognize, all at once, exactly who's standing among them. I want to be honest about what I felt, standing there absorbing that description, hearing publicly articulated a summary of my own career's actual impact that I had genuinely never heard spoken aloud in quite those terms, not even by myself, across 5.5 decades of carrying that work quietly. I glanced toward Caroline, tears still visible on her face, and toward Preston beside her, his expression now carrying something considerably more complicated than the earlier confusion, a dawning, uncomfortable recognition that seemed to be settling into something deeper as the moment continued to unfold around him. The memorial ceremony continued from there, moving into its planned program, but I want to tell you about what happened afterward, because I think it matters more to the actual resolution of this story than the dramatic moment itself. Preston did not approach me during the immediate aftermath, remaining at a visible distance throughout the remainder of the ceremony, his earlier confident, dismissive bearing entirely replaced by something considerably more subdued and, I could tell even from a distance, genuinely uncomfortable. It was nearly 2 hours later, once the formal event had concluded and most of the crowd had begun dispersing, that he finally approached me, alone, his composed business demeanor entirely gone. "Wallace," he said, using my first name for what I believe was the first time in 14 years of marriage to my daughter, his voice carrying a rawness I'd genuinely never heard from him before. I don't even know how to start this conversation. "You don't have to start it with anything elaborate, Preston," I said. I heard what you said earlier. I understand you didn't know the specifics of what I actually did. That's not entirely your fault, given how little I've ever volunteered about it myself. That's generous of you, he said, but I don't think it fully accounts for what I actually did. I've spent 14 years treating you as a category rather than a person, Wallace. Someone whose retirement and background simply didn't register as significant by whatever standards I've apparently been using to measure people's worth. And today, I found out, in the most public and humiliating way possible, exactly how wrong that measurement has been. I don't know how to reconcile watching 400 people stand in silent tribute to a man I called a nobody less than an hour earlier. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. My first instinct was not entirely generous. Part of me wanted to let the discomfort of that realization sit a while longer, let him fully absorb the weight of what he'd said and what he'd just witnessed in direct, uncomfortable contrast. But I thought of Doris, and the particular grace she always modeled in difficult family moments, and I found something steadier instead. Preston, I said, I'm not upset because I need public recognition to validate what I did during my career. I never sought this kind of moment, and honestly, part of me is still slightly uncomfortable with how much attention it drew. But I do think you need to sit with something important, not because I want to punish you, but because I think you genuinely need to hear it. My worth, and the worth of men and women like me, was never contingent on 400 veterans standing on a country club lawn to prove it. It was already there, built across decades of work most people, including you, never had reason to see or understand. You just never asked the right questions. I know, Preston said, his voice breaking. I think I've spent my entire adult life measuring worth through the exact metrics my own career runs on. Visible deals, visible titles, things you can point to and explain in a single sentence at a cocktail party. And I never once considered that some of the most significant contributions a person can make are the ones that, by their very nature, never translate into that kind of easily displayed currency. We talked for nearly an hour that afternoon, sitting together on a quiet corner of the now largely empty lawn, the catering staff beginning to quietly clear tables in the background, a conversation considerably more honest than anything Preston and I had managed across 14 years of marriage to my daughter. I told him, in general terms, about the specific work I'd done in 1967, about the training command years, about what it had actually felt like carrying decades of quiet, largely invisible contribution without ever expecting or seeking the kind of recognition I just unexpectedly received. I told him about specific young officers I'd trained, men whose names Preston had never heard, whose careers had unfolded across decades in ways I'd only ever learned about secondhand, through occasional letters or chance encounters at veteran gatherings. Preston, for his part, opened up in ways I hadn't previously seen from him, describing his own relationship with his late father, a man who had, by Preston's account, been almost entirely absent emotionally throughout Preston's childhood, present physically but rarely engaged in any meaningful way, a father whose own worth Preston had learned to measure entirely through visible, tangible markers of professional success, because that had been the only currency his father had ever seemed to value or notice. I think, Preston said, staring out across the now quiet lawn, I built my entire framework for measuring people's worth around exactly what my own father valued, because some part of me was still trying to earn his approval even years after he passed. And I never once stopped to consider that framework might be genuinely broken, might be causing me to overlook people who actually deserved my respect, until today forced me to confront it directly, in the most public way possible. I found myself, hearing that admission, feeling something considerably more complicated than simple vindication. A genuine, unexpected compassion for a man who had, in his own way, been carrying his own quiet weight for decades, just as I had carried mine, though the specific shapes of our burdens had led us toward very different outward expressions. In the 4 months since that Memorial Day, something has genuinely shifted in how Preston relates to me, and, from what Caroline has shared, in his broader approach to how he measures people's worth more generally. He's asked, more than once, real questions about my career, about specific decisions and challenges from my training command years, questions that carry genuine curiosity rather than the previous polite, surface-level dismissiveness. He mentioned, during a recent visit, that he'd started reading more broadly about military history and veteran experiences, wanting some general understanding of a world he'd apparently spent 14 years standing adjacent to without ever genuinely trying to understand. He specifically mentioned reading about the broader Vietnam veteran experience, the particular difficulty many of us faced coming home to a country that treated our service with discomfort rather than recognition, telling me it had reframed, considerably, how he thought about the quiet reticence he'd always simply attributed to my personality rather than to anything historically specific. Colonel Achebe and I have stayed in closer touch since that Memorial Day as well, meeting for coffee twice now, and he mentioned, during our most recent conversation, that the moment on that lawn had become something of a small, meaningful story within the regional veterans community itself. Veterans who'd been present that day sharing it with others who hadn't, a ripple effect that continues, in small ways, to connect people across generations of service who might never otherwise have crossed paths. He told me that several younger veterans, hearing the story secondhand, had specifically sought him out afterward, wanting to understand more about the tactical protocols I'd developed, wanting to trace, for their own understanding, exactly how that kind of quiet analytical work had shaped training they themselves had received decades after I'd actually developed it. Preston attended a veterans support event with me last month, the first time in 14 years he's shown any genuine interest in the broader community I remain connected to, and Caroline told me, afterward, that he'd spent much of the drive home asking thoughtful, engaged questions about specific veterans he'd met and their own stories, a curiosity that felt, given everything that had happened, like a meaningful and lasting shift rather than a temporary reaction to one dramatic afternoon. He's also, Caroline mentioned, started specifically introducing me to his business colleagues differently, no longer the offhand, dismissive characterization from that Memorial Day, but something closer to genuine, if still somewhat imprecise, respect, describing me now as someone who'd had a genuinely significant military career he's still learning the details of, a description that, while still necessarily general, carries an entirely different weight than what I'd overheard that afternoon. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old veteran called a nobody by his son-in-law at a country club gathering. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. Real worth, the kind built across decades of quiet, difficult, often invisible contribution, doesn't require public recognition to be genuine. But sometimes, unexpectedly, that recognition arrives anyway, not because we sought it, but because the community we quietly served and quietly shaped remembers what we contributed, even when the people closest to us never bothered to ask. And when it does arrive, unexpectedly and undeniably, it has a way of teaching the people who dismissed us something considerably more lasting than any single confrontation ever could. I spent 14 years being quietly dismissed as an insignificant old nobody by my own son-in-law. It took 400 veterans, standing spontaneously in unified silence on a country club lawn, to finally show him exactly how wrong that assessment had been, but it's taken the months since, conversation by conversation, for that recognition to become the kind of genuine, lasting understanding that a single remarkable moment alone could never fully provide. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life whose quiet contributions you might not fully understand, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because we have a new story like this one every week.